Comrades. Well, look, we live in an age of gathering. I was going to say catastrophe, but catastrophe. A pandemic, most menacingly, an immediate, which clearly can't be dealt with by just vaccine nationalism in a few rich countries, rising sea levels, a heating planet, and all of this accompanied by staggering levels of inequality that scar society, where in country after country, workers seem to face an endless squeeze on their living standards, and where there are welfare states, they're becoming increasingly threadbare. And where work and the workplace itself, and this is perhaps less talked about, it's kind of one of the great dirty secrets of our society. For more and more people, it is a toxic, far from being a sort of positive liberatory experience, is toxic. Overwork, stress, bullying are a familiar tale to millions of workers across Britain. Now, none of that is news, least of all to people on this call. The real question is, what can be done to address it? What's the solution to these these kind of crises that we face? And that's a serious and challenging question. I think one thing just at the offset that is clear, and I think we probably all agree on, that even the beginning of any solution to these is going to come from Starmer's Labour. Starmer's project is hardly one of launching a war on capitalism. Quite the contrary, his project is precisely to launch a war on anyone who might dare to challenge any aspect of capitalism. That's not where the solution is going to come from. Now, many socialists have always kind of raised an argument about the solution is to look to workers' organisation and to workers' struggles, especially trade unions, strikes, organisation, and so on. Karl Marx, in many ways, has the most radical of that position, which, if you think about his famous injunction at the end of the Communist Manifesto, workers of the world unite, he's both making a claim that the working class, through its collective capacity to paralyze the flow of profits through strike action, to paralyze, in other words, the lifeblood of capitalism itself, to resist the encroachments of employers and more broadly the rich. But he's saying something more. It's a stronger claim that Marx and Marxists have made, which is the working class can't just resist, but it has the potential to be the key to the transformation of society and the creation of a social order without exploitation and class division, and to organise, crucially, production on a democratic basis. Now, I think, again, we can probably all agree that to say perhaps that there is an intense scepticism about the claim that workers have the ability to offer a systemic challenge to capitalism, I think would be an understatement. And I think probably huge numbers of people are sceptical about even more modest claims that workers have the ability to fight back and rebuild trade union organisation and so on. And it's not just on the kind of political and intellectual right of the spectrum that there's scepticism about the working class. Even on the radical left, I think there's a deep questioning of those arguments from Marx and afterwards. Now, there's a lot of questions here. We're not going to touch on all of them. What I do want to pick up, though, is a kind of argument, which, again, probably familiar to people, that goes along lines like this, which is to say, okay, look, even if we grant that perhaps in the second half of the 19th century, the first 3/4 of the 20th century, which often seen as the era of mass industrial production, widespread factory system and so on, that Marx's claims may have had some plausibility. But here in the 21st century, where we've had, 45 years in a country like Britain of neoliberalism, that is where the sort of unregulated play of the market and the commodification of, well, seemingly everything in society has had much greater sway. That claim about the sort of the potential power, the structural capacity of the workers, not just to resist, but also to transform society, is no longer plausible. That collective power has been lost, runs the argument. And that in other words, that there are major changes to the world of work that have robbed workers of that capacity to change the world, or even to engage sometimes in effective militancy. And just again, to spell it out, these arguments are probably familiar, run along the lines of pointing to deindustrialization, the decline of industrial production, the rise of services and white collar work, and often an assumption, not always spelt out, but that somehow white collar workers or service workers have less power than their predecessors in heavy industry or the coal mines and so on. Secondly, that what industrial production does still take place is no longer on a local or even national basis, but is globalized and spread across the planet. And that means multinationals can quite, with relative ease, move production around the world to where labor is cheapest, or where militancy and trade union organization is at its most minimal. In other words, production is sort of footloose. And there's many a trade unionist, certainly many a trade union official, that does have that kind of assumption that, hey, if you go on strike, they'll simply move the factory, close it and move it elsewhere. And therefore we lack that kind of power. And the third strand is the argument about precarity, that something about the nature of work and employment itself has been transformed, and that there has been and is an inexorable rise and expansion of short-term jobs with much more easily terminable, people can be dismissed from contracts much more easily, that the workforce itself is therefore more transient, more unstable. You don't have people working together with some degree of security on a long-term basis, and that people are much more vulnerable to the diktat of the employer under the threat of being quite easily dismissed. And indeed, this is the whole talk that we hear endlessly of the rise of the gig economy. And at some of its most extreme formulations, it's almost an idea that there is now a separate interest between workers on some degree of permanent contract with some relative level of security and regularity about their employment, and those on insecure, precarious contracts, and that those with a permanent work are almost a kind of privileged shrinking elite. And there is now a fatal division where you once had the potential for common interest that's been fractured. What emerges from this kind of picture is, I think, a view of workers. People may say, well, okay, they're still workers, perhaps they're still a working class, but they are now the abject victims who are utterly disposable by employers. The key theme here is powerlessness, and the suggestion that workers are much more fragmented, much weaker, much harder to organise. Now, I'm going to offer 10, 15 minutes left. I'm not going to be able to answer every aspect, but I want to make a few observations why I think this is actually an utterly misleading picture of the reality, and actually doesn't correctly locate the real problems that we face in the working class movement and the trade unions. Firstly, deindustrialization. Well, the first caveat there is, if you look globally, we've also seen a massive spread of industrial production. I mean, most obviously, although not only, with China, there's massive industrialization that's taken place. But even if you come to countries in the West, and actually this is especially true of Britain, where there has been a long-term process of the decline of the numbers employed in the industrial workforce, that's not actually the same as a fall in industrial output. I mean, it might surprise people that the highest level of industrial output in Britain was not in 1930 or even 1970, it was in the 21st century. In other words, what's happening is there are fewer workers, but because of increasing productivity, they produce more output. And each individual worker, correspondingly, makes a greater profit, arguably increasing rather than diminishing the potential power of those industrial workers. And industrial production doesn't just take place in a sort of isolated, self-contained way. Industrial production takes place it's embedded in complexes of interdependent production and distribution networks, often across countries or even continents. Think about global supply chains that far from giving all the whip hand to the employer just to be footloose and so on, and move where they have spare capacity and they can just move production around, the competition over logistics, over just in time, of keeping reserves, keeping inventories, things sitting in warehouses is seen as inefficient and unprofitable. Often those supply chains are extremely taut and vulnerable. People might remember early in the year when that huge container ship going through the Suez Canal heading to Rotterdam, the Ever Given, I think it's one of the biggest ever built, got stuck in the Suez Canal for 6 days, and it in itself gave a huge jolt to the world's supply chains. Well, here's a suggestion: if workers on these ships took collective action and strikes, they'd be in an incredibly powerful position to push the bosses to the table. And actually, on a slightly less dramatic basis, but in Britain, I think, without exaggerating, there is a bit of an uptick at the moment of strikes and disputes amongst heavy good vehicles drivers, encouraged by the new leader of the Unite Union, Sharon Graham, you know, where people on contracts particularly to supply goods are winning up to 20% pay rises in some cases, because they're exploiting their potential. In fact, there's shortages as well, at the heart of those logistic systems that capitalism depends on. Secondly, the rise of service jobs, of white collar work, which is again a long-term process predating neoliberalism right through the 20th century, it hasn't led to a kind of growing professionalization of more and more people lifted up into the affluent and secure middle classes. Far from it, it's led to what would be better described as a process of proletarianization, where as there are more and more clerical workers required, as there are more and more health workers required to keep a healthy workforce, education workers, to bring it closer to home, to create an educated, skilled workforce to make those profits, and so on, or tax collectors, etc., etc. As those numbers have expanded, they've been increasingly subject to exactly the same discipline, pressures, and pay squeezes that industrial and manual workers have been used to. And that, in turn, has laid the basis for white-collar service worker trade unionism and indeed strikes. And this is an ongoing process that affected people like civil servants in the last generation, but it's an ongoing process. I mean, one example, the Royal College of Nursing had its first strike. I think it was last year in Northern Ireland. It's just had its first strike ballot. Now, I mean, the bad news is they had a good vote, but they're not going to hit the thresholds. But still, this is a remarkable development for an organisation in the health service that I think still has as its patron the Queen Mother. So what was once a very conservative organisation has now faced pressures to act like any other trade union. The Royal College of Midwives just saw a large number of its members on a rank and file basis, not really officially through the union, organise mass protests over cuts to funding a couple of weeks ago. These kind of transformations have taken place. And I think the argument that service workers or white collar workers have no power doesn't square with the facts. Again, a couple of examples. The fact that school teachers, particularly in the National Education Union last January, when you think back, it took, under Section 44, refused to go into unsafe schools and effectively forced Boris Johnson to reverse his decision on the Sunday that schools would reopen. By the Monday, he'd suddenly discovered that perhaps they weren't safe after all. It wasn't the science or his change, it was the collective power of not to directly shut down profits, but still the collective power forced the government to retreat. Equally, if white collar workers, service industry workers have no power, how do we explain how the strikes that many of you will have taken part in 2018 forced to retreat over the attacks on the pension scheme, or the strike at Liverpool University by UCU members forced the ending of the 47 redundancies that were originally planned, or the strikes in a number of FE colleges by UCU members have won serious concessions from their management. They have that collective power. That's a reality. In other words, what we've certainly seen a big restructuring of the economy. This is inherent in capitalism. Some of the old centres of working class militancy and organisation, like the mining industry, parts of traditional, have gone, but capitalism is compelled, if you like, to recreate new concentrations of workers who also have a potential power, some of which we've seen glimpses of. What then is the argument about precarity and the gig economy? And I think I want to make a couple of points here. One is, let's not stress the novelty here. There are enormous continuities throughout the history of capitalism. This is not a new problem. I mean, when we look at things like zero-hour contracts and so on, you know, these things may be organized through an app or a text message, but they're essentially a kind of rebranding of a very old problem of casualization of labor and capitalism's inability, even in some of the richest countries at the top of the kind of pecking order of the capitalist system like Britain, to offer all workers kind of regularity of employment and income that would allow some minimum level of planning of their lives. It's utterly devastating, and it has a very, very long history. Moreover, and especially at moments of rising working class militancy, we have seen supposedly unorganized, unorganizable, casualized workers written off, sometimes even by the socialists of their time and so on, challenge with success that casualization. I mean, the most famous example is the Great Docker Strike in London in 1889, which is a pivotal moment in British trade union history, where on the docks you would have a small core of permanent workers who had some trade union traditions, alongside a mass, I think it was 60,000 workers, chasing at best 30,000 jobs, even on a good day, often sometimes just for a few on a daily basis, queuing up at the docks, fighting each other in some horrible situation. Nonetheless, they found the basis of unity, and unity indeed with some of those more permanent workers who had traditions of training, with the explosive anger of the casualized workers, and won a signal victory, which really laid the basis for mass trade unionism in Britain beyond the kind of craft exclusive workers of the Victorian era. And I mean, a union like the Unite Union can in many ways trace at least part of its origins directly to that strike and the trade union organization it built. I mean, I think it's possible, you know, I think there's a tendency to imagine that somehow in a previous era, there was this kind of completely homogenous, undifferentiated working class with exactly the same kind of conditions and so on. That's never been the reality. And one just interesting story to illustrate this. I mean, the observant amongst you may have noticed that that brilliant strike at the Royal College of Art that was taking place last month, the strikers put up a sign outside the front saying Royal College of Art, the sports direct of higher education. I mean, it's a brilliant slogan, given the rampant levels of casualization at RCA. Sports direct, of course, is notorious, justifiably, for employing people on casualized contracts, and especially its giant warehouse in Shirehampton. And some people may know that it's actually literally, I mean, the same spot built on a former mine that was closed. And that then becomes a story that symbolizes, you know, we once had these kind of working class organization, some level of dignity at work and collective organization and indeed traditions of militancy. Now it's all gone, replaced by casualized workers who lack power and so on. That's not actually the full story. One of the points that Jane Hardy makes in her fellow UCU member and fellow SWP member makes in her new book about worker resistance in 21st century Britain is that the mining industry, especially in Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire, where Shirehampton is on the border, was dominated until the 1930s by a system of very divisive subcontracting, where the mine owners would employ people who would then in turn employ people and probably employ people and so on. Very, very fragmented, very, very divisive. And militants, often socialists and communists and so on, would had to organize to defeat that system in order to build a serious trade union organization, something they achieved in the 1930s. So again, these aren't new problems that we face. And we've seen examples of organizing against them at the moment, but clearly in the UCU, where we've seen casualized workers able to join together with workers on relatively more permanent contracts, although given as a wave of redundancies, even that has its limits, clearly. That's one example. I mean, another is, I mean, again, a great symbol of the gig economy, supposedly, Uber. There's a union, people may not have heard of it. I mean, it's called the App Drivers and Couriers Union, which has been organizing Uber drivers. It's scored a series of victories over Uber to challenge the notion bogus notion that they're just self-employed workers and Uber's just an agency and so on. They've won worker status for the drivers, which gives people more rights to sick pay and so on. And they organised the first Uber strike. And I think the union now claims 5,000 workers and is growing rapidly and organising branches around the country, mainly based on migrant workers. So again, there are examples where people could not powerless and have challenged successfully. The second point I want to make, which is related, which is I think that it's clear from any kind of real engagement with the data that there has been no great explosion overall across the British economy of casualised work. There's no qualitative transformation. It's always been with us. And it's always been a minority of the workforce. That can vary from one sector to another, but taking as a whole, it's clear that the sort of permanent workforce on some element of secure contracts has been relatively stable and has been for the last 4 decades at around 90% of the workforce. Or to take another example, what the data suggests, and it becomes a bit hazy after a certain point back in the past, but that the average time that people spend in the same in a job is 16 years, which is basically the same as the mid-1970s, which again points to a picture of an element of stability of the workforce that cuts against the idea that everything's just so unstable and everyone's so people spend time together in the same workplaces, and that gives people opportunity. It doesn't mean everybody. There are casualised contracts. It varies from sector to sector because employers are under contradictory pressures. They want, of course, to erode rights, to squeeze workers, to match labour to fluctuating demand, to limit security. But they also want to ensure that they have a reliable workforce that will turn up each day, do what it's supposed to, it has the necessary skills, and that constantly recruiting and constantly training has additional costs that they'd rather not spend. And there's a tension between the two. And in certain sectors, hotels most notoriously, care work, and scandalously, right across higher education, casualisation is very profound. In other sectors, much less so. So that's the picture. This is not a new problem, and it's not one that's qualitatively transformed. And I suppose to sort of bring things to a conclusion, I think the argument that says we have lost our underlying potential capacity to resist and indeed to change the world is not true. The real problem we face is not that objective loss of working class power. The real problem we face is gaining the confidence and the organisation to use that potential power on a much bigger and more combative scale. And to do that will require a complete transformation of the trade union movement to become much more combative, much more organised, much more militant. And not only could it then win victories that push back employers, but it would also spread union organisation to new layers of the work. This is how it's always happened in the past. When there's a rising militancy, whole new sectors of workers get organised and learn from that example. And how will that transformation take place? I'm pretty confident that it will not take place through the existing trade union officials, the full-time apparatus of the union, which is often very marked by caution, routinism, often focused on bargaining and compromise. The driving force, as it happened in the past, has to come from activists in workplaces, building organisation and building resistance with the people they work around them. And ultimately, that needs more than just individual workplaces operating on their own. It means building a network of militants through different struggles who can begin to push for much bigger action and begin to transform their unions. And that I think, again, all the evidence of the past as well as contemporary examples point to that requires a level of commitment, vision, a framework for experiences that puts a premium on socialist organisation, which is orientated not on capturing the Labour Party or primarily capturing trade union leaderships and positions, although where that can be helpful in terms of opening a space for resistance. It has to be based on where we have our potential power, and that is the collective organisation in the workplace. And that requires socialists and to act, and socialists have always played a central role. I mean, the Great Docker Strike in the 1889, people like Eleanor Marx, Karl Marx's daughter, William Morris, the miners I mentioned, it was often Communist Party activists that were central to that. And I think that's true today, whether it's the battles on Uber workers, health workers, education workers, heavy goods vehicle drivers, and that socialist network that links and can link that day-to-day battle over pay, over casualisation, over pensions, over workload, with a wider project of socialism from below, socialism coming through the struggles of ordinary workers, or as Karl Marx used to put it, the self-emancipation of the working class. And that's the kind of network, that's the kind of organisation that the Social Workers' Party is trying to build.